In the face of an unpredictable future, we're all called upon each and every day to think of out-of-the-box ways to tackle challenges to our environment, well-being, or how to row your boat gently down the stream. Welcome to the Grand Challenges Podcast, a show about inspiring individuals who are stepping up to these challenges and are here to share stories about their own personal journey towards making our world a better place. I'm your host, Peter Marcus Bach, a water engineer who merrily integrates and with a passion for connecting across expertise and providing you access to knowledge from the cutting edges of science, engineering, technology, and design. My guest today is Dr. Abishek Narayan, a research scientist at the Department of Sanitation, Water and Solid Waste for Development at the Swiss Federal Institute of Aquatic Science and Technology. Abishek is very active on research in the wash sector and has been working on integrated approaches for sustainable sanitation practices in the Global South. Today on the show, we learn more about how sanitation planning is rapidly evolving beyond the toilet and that integration is necessary if we want clean water for all. Abishek shares his experience with life plans and destiny and his hopes to one day row in a clean river in his hometown in Chennai, India. For more information, refer to the show notes over at petermbach.com/podcast. Thank you for joining and please enjoy the show. Abishek, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Peter. Happy to be here.
Great to have you here. And I think it's going to be a very interesting show because we're touching upon a very important topic that has undergone a big evolution and a pretty rapid one as well. But we'll get to that. We have quite a lot of time, so looking forward.
Likewise.
When I saw some of the interest that you had, one thing caught my attention, which I thought was really, really funny because I read about this particular country a few years ago. You enjoy traveling, and of all the countries that you could name, there was one that you highlighted, which was Liechtenstein, which is right next to Switzerland. So we are both in Zurich at the moment, and it's a very short journey away. And I looked up Liechtenstein a few years ago, and I thought, what are they famous for? And I noticed that they are the world's largest producer of false teeth. That's not the reason why you enjoy Liechtenstein, right?
No, for now my teeth are good, so that's not why I love the country. No, I think Liechtenstein is a very special country. No, I'm not being paid to say this though, but it's special because I've had some very pleasant experiences there. I think I've been to Liechtenstein 3 times already. That is more than an average Swiss person who lives 20, 30 kilometers away from Liechtenstein. Most Swiss people that I've met here haven't even been there. So that's interesting. But what I really like about the country was when I first visited there, I had a series of very positive things that happened. The first was I was looking to get on this sort of a tourist train, which is just a long set of carts pulled together by a toy train of sorts. And there was a session or a run that was supposed to go at 2 p.m. But I was there at, so there was one at 2 p.m. and then one at 4 p.m. And then I was there at 2:45. And I said, my train is at 3:30, so I will miss the next one. So is there anything you can do? And the train driver basically said, yeah, no problem. Just hop on. I'll give you a ride.
Oh.
That's not something that happens. Definitely not in Switzerland, but also not in many places. So I thought that was quite a pleasant one. And similarly, I was hiking there the following year again, and I got lost, and it was snowing heavily. And it's not easy to get lost in Liechtenstein, right? It's
quite small.
Yeah, but I still managed to get lost up in the mountains somewhere, and it was snowing heavily, and I didn't really know how to get to someplace. And in the distance, I saw a house with some lights on. I thought, okay, let's go and check if they can give me an abode for just until the snow ends. And then surprisingly, when I entered that house, there was a yoga retreat happening there, of all places. So, and then I joined them. I had soup with them. We did some yoga together. And that was also a very interesting, serendipitous experience.
That's really funny.
And the third interesting experience was I also had a chance to talk to the Prince of Liechtenstein once as part of this St. Gallen Symposium and ask some questions. And that was also a very pleasant experience because by the time my interest in Liechtenstein got out with our colleagues and stuff, there were many conversations about, but do you know that there's a prince? It's still, maybe you should go talk to him. And funnily enough, that happened as well. And I asked a question about what happens when Liechtenstein has a diverging policy with Switzerland because they still have the same currency, they have the same sort of border controls and so on. So I was just curious on that. And he replied, he gave it a minute to think and then replied saying, yeah, that's not probably going to happen. But anyway, it's just a series of very interesting encounters with the country that then I was very happy to, basically visit again whenever I get a chance.
And 3 interesting impactful threads that I think reflect some of the things that you've been through as well in your life. So if I start with the snow, I guess it's the type of climate that you had to get used to when you came to Switzerland, because you're originally from India, and it's a very different kind of climate. I know you've been to London as well. You were at Oxford for quite some time. So that's one of the first interesting things, getting lost in the snow. I certainly wouldn't wish that upon myself. But then connecting with people through yoga, which I didn't expect, or I guess you wouldn't have expected either. Those two experiences already giving you that sense of familiarity.
Maybe I can even tell you what was my first few shocks in Switzerland from India.
Let's go for that.
So where I come from is Chennai, a city in South India, a coastal city, and it's flat. It's almost as flat as Netherlands. To reach the nearest hills and mountains, it's going to take us a while. And then I come to Switzerland, and the first week we go hiking. And that's to a small hill in Zurich called Uetliberg. Although it says mountain, by now I understand that it's a hill.
Don't worry, I make the same mistake. I like to call things mountains, and then people tend to correct me. No, that's just a hump.
Exactly. Yeah, so the first time I went hiking, I was trying to gasp my breath and trying to keep up with my friends who were hiking up. And then I see this really much older lady, probably in her 80s, kind of racing me and then walking up. And then I thought, okay, this is what Switzerland does to you. Clean air, clean water, and lots of mountains, and having this whole culture of being so close to nature and just strolling up hills. That really caught my attention since that very first week. Since then, I've loved hiking, although it's not something I'm familiar with at all from India.
Have you found the hiking routes through Chennai as well?
No, I don't think. First, to kind of juxtapose scales, right? My neighborhood has more people than all of Zurich. And Chennai as a city has more people than all of Switzerland. So Chennai has about 10, 11 million people, and Switzerland's like 8.5. So the scales are very different. And that also means that the trams and, the scale of time that it takes to commute is also very different. When you take trams in the city of Zurich, I'm often very surprised how frequent tram stops are. Because by the time the tram accelerates, it already has to decelerate between two stops. And that's how frequent the stops are. And to me, that was also very surprising, because in these trams, you get something called 20 Minuten, the 20-minute newspaper, which one would think, people commute for 20 minutes on an average, so maybe this is what the newspaper must be named. But I think it should be named 2 minutes, because
that's true.
That's how close things are in Zurich, and that's often how frequent tram stops are.
I think the expectation was that you can read the whole thing in 20 minutes, assuming you're going to travel from one end of the city to the other. I can certainly browse it in 2 minutes, but oftentimes a lot of interesting articles that you do want to read. And so now you've gotten used to life in Switzerland, I guess, because you've been here for how many years now?
5 years.
5 years, yeah. That's about the same as me. And so you're based in Switzerland at the Swiss Federal Institute of Aquatic Science and Technology, at SANDEC, the Department of Sanitation, Water and Solid Waste for Development. So you work a lot with countries in the Global South. And you're based in the WASH sector. What do we understand by the WASH sector?
So WASH stands for Water, Sanitation and Hygiene. In few other cases, some people interpret it as water and sanitation for health. And, the way I see it is, when you say water and sanitation, they are two sides of the same coin. And water as a field can largely be split, at least in my mind, as water resource management, where we're talking about rivers, dams, both natural and man-made infrastructure, where water can be stored both for economic and people needs, but also for natural needs for the environment itself. And then the other big sector is water and sanitation, or WASH sector, which is a lot more people-focused about drinking water supply, sanitation or environmental sanitation, which now starts to also include things such as grey water, storm water, rainwater, and things like this. All of this together will also come under environmental sanitation.
Which is a nice way of pushing, I guess, this move towards integration, because as someone in the urban water field, I tend to see the water sectors as separate. I look at water supply, drainage, and sewage. And coming from Australia, we have separate sewage and drainage systems as well. So multiple different streams of water. But in the case of WASH, it's really saying, well, no, actually they're all interlinked. And it's not just water, but also solid waste, the hygiene, all these aspects.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we often as engineers or as planners, we forget is WASH is a service. It's not just an infrastructure, right? So we need to think not only as an engineer/planner, but we need to think of it as a service provider. and understand what the user perspective is. For someone living in a city, they will encounter only one agency to pay for water and sanitation in most cases. And to them, within a house, if you imagine, there's different streams of water that's interacting with each other. There's the rainwater, which sometimes is collected. There's the stormwater, which often passes by. There is black water, which is what you flush. There is gray water, which comes out of your washing machine, your dishwashing, etc.
Anything that is not as polluted as, say, the water that comes out of your toilet.
Yeah, anything that doesn't have fecal contamination in it, right? Anything where typically your flushed away substances are not there. So that's kind of the big difference between gray and black. So for a user, you don't make so many different separations. For you, it's just, it's all water. And in front of you often, and the other big caveat is you mentioned about Australia, right? And we are here in Switzerland. And I know that a lot of work that you do is kind of directed towards middle and high income countries where the context is very different. Now, when you come to a low and middle income country, the context in these cities are very different, right? And often these are located close to the equator or definitely not very far away. And in these kinds of cases, the environmental conditions are also very different. So you have rainfall that is often more than 1,000 millimeters. You therefore have to significantly deal with rain and stormwater as a separate channel rather than combining sewage and stormwater as most cities in Europe do. And then when you typically travel to a city in the global south, what you might encounter is there is a stormwater channel where there is solid waste that is clogging the stormwater system. And sometimes the solid waste is leaching into water sources. And sometimes even the sewage is connected directly to the stormwater systems, right? So that's a typical example of how these different streams of what we think is water and waste kind of interact. And these three service chains, as we call them, are very closely linked to each other. So this is one of the projects that we are trying to explore in 2 small towns in Uganda. This is in partnership with the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, where we want to try and understand if we plan these 3 services together, instead of having negative interactions between these 3 sectors, could we possibly turn them into positive interactions? Could we think about reusing water from grey water sources for flushing instead of flushing away fresh water? Can we co-compost organic and fecal waste? Because that's maybe easier, that you can double down on infrastructure and so on. So those are all questions which are right now explorative that we are trying to find answers to in 2 small towns in Uganda.
And they also reflect the ongoing paradigm shift that we shouldn't be just looking at wastewater as a waste, but as a valuable resource where we can gain energy, nutrients, and recycled water.
Absolutely. And again, going back to cities with few resources, with resource constraints, you have to understand that sewers and building centralized infrastructure takes a lot of money. It takes a lot of space. And to flush, it takes a lot of water as well. And to pump things, it takes a lot of energy as well. So there's a lot of money, time, energy, and water. Not all 4 of them are available in plenty in these small cities or even in mega cities in the global south.
And this already indicates that traditional solutions of a rigidly planned centralized system will probably not be the most effective solution.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it all depends on context. In certain parts, again, when you say centrally focused infrastructure, the scale again matters. For example, Zurich's wastewater treatment plant would be able to treat only about 1/10 of the waste of the city that I come from, Chennai. Right? The scales are very different. So all these big mega cities in the global south, which are rapidly growing, the scales of what decentralization even means is already a big question that we have to figure out.
And I think we have to also be cognizant of this growing population, how it compares. In one of the policy briefs that you published recently on Citywide Inclusive Sanitation, which we will get into, because I think that's really the framing around it. But just for the listeners, just to illustrate this, you mentioned between 2015 and 2030, Africa's population is going to grow by 42%. And now that sounds little, but actually represents 500 million people. And in Asia, it's going to be very similar growth, even if it's only 12% growth in the continent. And it's going to take place in urban areas. So cities are going to be growing denser, bigger. A lot of them may not have all the necessary infrastructure already in place. And I guess we have to act fast. Otherwise, we're going to be facing a sanitation crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think urbanization has its positives and also negatives. One of the challenges that urban centers often struggle with is the migration of people from rural areas to urban areas, the growth of the urban areas itself, the sprawl and so on. And what links closely with this is the access to basic services, of which water and sanitation are very high. And in this context, most of these cities are already struggling to provide basic services to its residents. And now you also keep moving the goalpost away because urbanization is much faster and much more rapid than the rate of providing services to these people. So we have a double whammy, basically.
Yeah.
And the unfortunate thing is that it's in these cities that the capacity challenges, the financial challenges, and the challenges of leveraging existing infrastructure are already at the highest, right? So it's a very difficult problem, and that's one of the reasons why I think there needs to be more research and more practice-oriented applied research that's done in this to help cities of this kind.
It sounds like a bleak picture, but I guess that's where a lot of your journey comes in, because in a way you've worked very heavily on a potential framework. I wouldn't say it's the silver bullet, because there isn't a silver bullet. As you said, it's context dependent. But you've worked on advancing the operationalization of a framework known as Citywide Inclusive Sanitation. We mentioned this just now. That can help cities, I guess, leapfrog to these kinds of sustainable and integrated solutions. Mm-hmm. How did you get into Citywide Inclusive Sanitation?
Citywide Inclusive Sanitation, or CWIS, as in short, as we call it. To answer your question on how I came into CWIS, I think I have to piece a few parts of the puzzle together, which will make it coherent. So my interest in water came from rowing the sport. So I was rowing in a very polluted river in India, in Chennai, in my home city, at the same time that I was also pursuing chemical engineering in a university there. I was already working on, advanced oxidation of particular pollutants in water. That was, high-tech research in the lab. And then in the evening, I would come and row in these polluted rivers. And then at some point, it struck. And it struck very much when I had an opportunity to row with the Olympian rower who came to our club in Chennai. And I had one outing with him. And then when we got off the water, I asked, hey, how do you like this river? I was very proud of my city and so on. And then he also had very nice things to say. He said, yeah, it's a brilliant river because it's calm, so it's easy to row upstream and downstream. It's in the middle of the city, so it's super easy to access. And then he went on to say, but it's such a pity that you people in the city have kept this river in such a polluted state. And that somehow, I think, struck something in me. And I thought, I need to do something about it. And that's when, my whole journey in water started. So I went to Delft first to do some research there and understood a little bit more on, best practices in water treatment, wastewater treatment, and so on. And then my naive self thought, maybe if we build some kind of treatment technology that's low cost, that could fix this water, the river itself could be restored, right? And then therefore for my bachelor thesis already, I built a sort of a reactor. It's a downflow hanging sponge reactor, which could possibly combine with a UASB technology, upflow anaerobic bed sludge reactor. And it was my naive self that thought, if I have this prototype and then I go and talk to the senior officials in the city and show them that this works, and with science we can solve a lot of things. But then I understood very quickly that you cannot solve a problem with engineering as a solution when the problem isn't fundamentally engineering.
Uh-huh.
So that then led me to help found this citizen action group called the Clean Adyar Initiative. Adyar is the river that we were rowing in. And soon I understood that everyone's interested, people are interested. So this is a platform where, volunteers can come, help clean the banks. We were trying to make some documentaries. We were engaging very closely with the bureaucrats of the city, giving feedback on the master plans, etc. And then I understood what gaps are in my own knowledge. So I understood that the biggest problem for urban water pollution is sewage that is coming into these rivers without any treatment, because either it's because of illegal connections to stormwater drains, or it's because the sewage treatment plants don't have the capacity to treat this. So then that's when I also understood my own gaps in my knowledge. We need science, policy, and management to kind of go together to solve these wicked problems that exist in cities across the world. And that's when I went to the UK for my master's at Oxford. And once I kind of understood a bit more on these aspects that I just mentioned, I had a chance to go to Ethiopia, to Addis Ababa, where I thought if the centralized treatment plants are the problem, then let's look at decentralized treatment plants. And Addis Ababa offered that kind of solution. It was a pioneer in Africa for that. And I understood that they built these large condominium housing complexes, low-cost housing complexes, affordable housing schemes. And then they didn't plan for sewage at all. And they realized that there's a timeline gap between building sewage treatment plants and building these houses, right? So therefore, they built decentralized treatment plants. And I thought, okay, this is the solution to everything. And then I went into understanding how this came about, why this came about. Is it successful? Is it failing? I understood that the problem is not for sewage management, is actually urban planning.
So you went from one to the next, to
the next, right? So I went from urban water pollution to wastewater and sewage and so on. And then from there, I understood that urban planning for basic services, including water and sanitation, is therefore the challenge. And that's when, I was presenting some of these results in the World Water Week in Stockholm. And that's where I had a chance to meet Christoph Luthi, who's the head of SANDEC, who's my boss. And he then offered this PhD that came about where I had an opportunity to link these three things that I found out as the challenges, right? Planning, sanitation and wastewater management, and urban water pollution in cities.
A perfect opportunity indeed.
Absolutely. And when you combine these three things in one way or the other, that's where CWIS comes about, or Citywide Inclusive Sanitation. So one of the first things that I understood is sanitation is not an engineering problem. It's not just a technical problem. You need to think about the social aspects. And one of the main reasons why sanitation infrastructure and water infrastructure for low-income communities and resource-poor contexts fail is because of poor planning. And CWIS was a very interesting framework where it said that we need to think about urban sanitation and WASH in general, not from an infrastructure point of view, but from a service point of view. And then when you break that down further, then you start to understand the 6 principles of CWIS.
And you mentioned, first key point is it's not another silver bullet. It is a process to creating that service. And it's not just infrastructure. It involves a whole range of elements that combine those 3 aspects that you mentioned that you've, I guess, had to encounter one after another after another. Sometimes it feels like the saying, the more I know, the less I know, is really true.
Oh, absolutely.
And really, and Murphy's Law as well, I guess, because sometimes you feel like things are going well. Everything, of course, absolutely goes wrong.
Yeah.
But yeah, you mentioned those key principles. And I think if I had to explain it to someone, that's how I would probably illustrate it as well. And as far as I can understand, these principles are based on equity, public and environmental health, a mix of technology. So that's where that infrastructure comes in. Comprehensive planning, because you mentioned urban planning is, city planning is where you felt that third issue started to crop up. And then monitoring and accountability and a mix of business models. Mm-hmm. I especially like these last 2 aspects because I feel like if you're going to really drive change and uptake, you're going to need to account for or monitor these systems over time. It's not just put it in, set it, and forget it. But maybe let's go through each of these principles briefly so that we can illustrate the whole framework.
Absolutely. I think that's a good idea to really understand CWIS as a concept. Mm-hmm. So the first principle is on equity. It basically says that the poor shouldn't pay more than the rich. In fact, if you're subsidizing, the subsidies must be targeted. However, currently what happens is 56% of all WASH, water and sanitation subsidies in the world go to the richest quintile of a city.
Oh.
And only 6% goes to the poorest quintile of a city. Now, the problem with this is because sewers get all the subsidies. And sewers are typically serving well-planned neighborhoods in the central business districts and so on, and which is often where the richer parts of the city live in. And the poor have a double whammy again because they have to pay more for a lesser quality of service because the state is not providing the service. The informal sector often is charging more but not meeting standards and so on. So that's the equity part, to make sure that everybody has access. And also there's a lot more on disabilities, gender-sensitive sanitation, and so on. But largely we're talking about making sure that no one is left behind.
But one of the key principles of sustainability already embedded right at the forefront, which is this equity intergenerational and intra-generational, so within and beyond generations as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So equity is a very difficult concept to unpack. But once you start unpacking, then you start to see the nuances and the trade-offs in providing safe sanitation at an equal cost, at an equal service level to everyone, right? And that's where the human right to water and sanitation also comes in. So there's that whole aspect. And the second principle is on
public and environmental health. I guess really the core focus here of what sanitation should be about.
Exactly. So when we think about sanitation, often we focus only on the people to make sure that people don't get sick because of fecal contamination. We want to make sure that people are not exposed to fecal contamination or any kinds of water sources which are contaminated with feces and so on, right? But somewhere down the line, we forgot that environment is also a stakeholder in this whole puzzle. And what's also important to soon note that there is no environmental health without public health, and there is no public health without environmental health. These two are also very closely connected.
We've seen this emerged in recent years, especially in adaptation to climate change, where we need to be focusing on protecting ecosystems because they themselves can provide us a lot of goods and services that we can benefit from. We see this a lot in the, in the city planning and the green city space, where ecosystem services, trying to maximize them, is put at the forefront nowadays.
100%. And it links closely with the fact that wastewater needs to be managed, not just displaced. You can't just send it out of the city and say, okay, it's not the city's problem anymore. And that's the whole thinking behind this, to prevent environmental leaks.
So to those thinking we can just send the waste to the moon, I don't think it's a good idea for the long run.
If someone's willing to fund displacing waste from Earth to the moon, then I think with that money, we can already solve all the waste problem in the world.
Until we start colonizing the moon, and then it becomes a problem later. So displacing not just in space, but also in time, I guess. We don't want to, we want to deal with it then and there. And it's not necessarily displacing that really needs to be done. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of other opportunities.
Yeah. And then the third one is about mix of technologies, right? And this basically says that a city is not homogeneous. A city has different parts. It could be topographically different. It could be demographically different, and so on. So we have different types of technologies. And we already established that, sewers are also not the silver bullet. So decentralization is also not the silver bullet. And there's also this whole non-sewer sanitation or fecal sludge management and things like that. And that is also not a silver bullet. However, if we can put different types of technologies together according to the needs of neighborhoods or parts of the city, then we are a bit more innovative in optimizing for affordability, for service provision, and for resource recovery and so on. So it's just to say that don't look at a city as just one solution fits all, but rather look at it as a mix of different solutions that go into different parts of the city.
And so mix of technologies really caters to that engineering mindset. It's where the engineers can start to have fun. And that also has to be coupled with the fourth principle, which is comprehensive planning.
Absolutely. So yes, engineers can help in many ways, but I think it's only part of the solution, right? Your technologies will fail if they're not maintained or operated well. Your technologies will fail if there is no capacity to handle these things. And your technology will fail if there is no money to run them, right? So that's where planning really comes in. To understand, of course, which kind of technology goes. That's also part of planning process. But also understanding what kind of governance mechanisms, what kind of operation and maintenance mechanisms, who will manage what kind of capacities are there. And these aspects which are often overlooked when we do conventional master planning. In CWIS, we are saying that this is really important. And a core principle here is also to make sure the communities are involved in the planning process. And of course, there is no gold standard saying that if communities are part of process A, B, and C, then it's great. If they are not part of D and E, then there's no such principle. But because each city has its own differences in reality. But the aim is to say that understand local needs better by involving the community, get their buy-in and acceptance so that the technology will potentially work well and will minimize chances of failure because of misunderstandings, because of technology rejection, and so on.
And I guess to illustrate this with a hypothetical example, but you can get the community to want to accept an innovative new toilet that is decentralized. But if they then just tell you to simply build it on the corner of their village next to a pristine river and no one wants to ever empty or maintain it, you risk polluting that river eventually if the thing breaks.
Absolutely. I think there are many, many examples of failure because of community rejection of certain types of solutions. I've personally seen quite a few, right? There's, for example, I've heard of the one where in Windhoek in Namibia, they've built many different toilets very far away from the community settlements, and nobody uses that. There are instances of toilets being built behind temples or very close to temples where certain types of communities say, no, we cannot pollute the temples by using toilets that shares a compound wall with them. There are instances of women and certain types of marginalized communities and disabled people not being able to access certain types of technologies or toilets that you mentioned because they're located in the wrong place or because they're being closed at certain hours of the day and so on. So these are all things that are not written in a book. We don't know where the parameters are for us to optimize. So it is really important to go out there and really understand from the user perspective, from the communities, what is required. And then you can minimize your chances of failure.
And these examples really illustrate that it's not just about convincing people to use the technology, but it's to be sensitive about the cultural context, the personal preferences, and to understand what you need to do to then familiarize people with something that they've probably never been exposed to in the first place.
Yeah.
That could potentially solve a lot of their problems.
Mm-hmm.
So no silver bullet, no one size fits all, but certainly a very interesting journey because you learn something about the society and you can cater to their particular familiarity as a result of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have monitoring and accountability.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's an interesting one because, again, since we're on the topic of decentralization, we did a large project in the city of Bangalore where there is about 3,000 decentralized treatment plants in the city.
3,000?
Yes.
Wow.
That's a very
that
big
is
number.
a lot.
Exactly. However, more than 80%, I'm giving a rough number here, are dysfunctional, are not meeting the standards. And one of the reasons for this is because there is no monitoring agency which is able to monitor all these 3,000 systems. And since there is no strict monitoring that is being enforced, people are not maintaining their treatment plants. And this is one of many reasons, but was a very significant reason that a project called 4S that happened at Eawag discovered.
And I noticed that this idea of monitoring and accountability is also it's a key concern in anything that's decentralized, whether it's decentralized energy systems or decentralized stormwater management or sanitation, because, I think people are too excited by the newness of it and they are willing to join that process of planning it and to see what the design looks like and to constructing it. But I think once it's in place, it tends to be forgotten after a while. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's also a financial aspect, the money to maintain these systems. Decentralization is not necessarily the easiest way to finance because you have cost sharing, you have different levels of responsibility and governance arrangements.
Absolutely. And it brings a very interesting question of public versus private good. So if your wastewater treatment plant is outside, then that's a public good. But if it's inside your house, then it becomes a private good. Although the water that comes out of the wastewater treatment plant, whether it's inside or outside, is again a public good. So you have these very complex sort of situations where can the state finance something? Can you subsidize something? And these are all things, especially when it comes to reuse, that we need to understand much more. Are there markets? Can the private sector enter? And that is yet another interesting project that is going to start at Eawag, also looking at the city of Bangalore and really understanding, okay, we have some idea about why decentralization happened, how it is at the moment. But if we want to leverage this and make sure that there is an incentive for every user to have their own treatment plants running and functional and being able to reuse the water, then what kind of markets are required? What kind of behavior change is required? What kind of technologies can predict whether the water quality is safe or not? And finally, what kind of governance mechanisms can we build around this?
And this is where the final principle also comes in, which is the mix of business models. You mentioned public, private, and I guess there's partnerships between that could be had.
Absolutely. One of the reasons that water and sanitation takes a backseat in city priorities is because there are competing agendas. And there is a constraint on the limited financial resources that are available for these cities. And one way to probably tackle this problem is by involving the private sector in certain cases where it's relevant and getting their support, both financially, but also in terms of technical expertise, also bringing best practices from across the world all into the cities. Of course, this has to be done in a way that is still equitable to the people, that is still sustainable to the nature and to the financial resources available and so on. And this also leads to many innovations that could be possible in these contexts. And a good example is there are a few companies in Nairobi who are providing container-based sanitation to slums.
Okay, container-based.
Yes, which means that you have sort of a toilet which has an attached container where the waste is collected.
Okay.
And once a week or twice a week, depending on frequency, there is a service provider who comes and collects the waste and uses that waste to, again, process and then possibly recover nutrients, recover energy by making it into pellets and so on. Or even another innovation that SANDEC has been working on is these black soldier fly larvae, which eat any kind of organic material that it gets and becomes a protein feed in the process.
Oh, nice.
So there's many innovations that already exist, and private sector is more likely to bring those innovations because they have the incentive to do so. And that is what is often referred to as a sanitation economy, because there is money to be made in water and sanitation because everybody needs water and sanitation in a city. And many studies show that despite income levels, people are willing to pay for sanitation. And maybe there is a small deficit that the public sector then comes in and fills, but that is much less than what it would cost them if they were to provide services by themselves.
But it's very reassuring that we have a bit of that economic research to back up the feasibility of the private sector innovating to help the public good.
Yeah. So I don't think we have a clear consensus that the private sector can make their ends meet by merely providing services and collecting revenue from, often cases, low-income communities. But there is ample evidence which shows that there is additional revenue streams. There are many benefits for this process as well. But again, the big caveat is these things will work only if the market is being regulated by the public sector itself.
No, definitely. And I think this is progressing actually quite rapidly, because I was looking at the history of CWIS, which you so kindly illustrated, and we'll put a link in the show notes to a really nice video as part of a massive online learning course. But you kind of illustrated the history that dated as far back as 2016 and has just evolved quite rapidly in the last few years. So in a way, you did your PhD on the topic pretty much at the perfect time when this was really in and growing.
Absolutely. I think I was very lucky to be at the right place at the right time, because I feel my PhD I was so blessed to have so much access to data and people. And this was a very important agenda across the world. And especially my case studies, many of them were in India. And India had its own sanitation mission called the Swachh Bharat, or the Clean India mission, where they put about $20+ billion into building, I think, about 110 million toilets. And sanitation was a very important agenda. And of course, the World Bank, the Gates Foundation, Asian Development Bank, WaterAid, and many, many other important institutions were part of this process. And by now, I think most institutions, be it international financial institutions or academics or international NGOs, etc., they've all kind of, I think, made a large agreement that CWIS is indeed the way forward for the urban sanitation agenda.
And I guess the most key event, or the most important thing that someone who wants to go into CWIS could start with, are the Manila Principles.
Yep, absolutely. So there are slightly different variations of the Manila Principles, but the one that we use is one of the more recent ones. And it just offers a framework to understand what CWIS means. It's not just one thing, right? It's these 6 different principles that we have to think together to make sanitation work. And it's also that not all 6 are probably relevant in all cases. In some cases, you can take 1 or 2 as a given. So it just is a good framework to begin with.
And I think these 6 principles that we've covered really illustrate that CWIS is more than just a mix of technologies, more than just trying to innovate in one space, but really a holistic approach to revolutionizing urban sanitation. But I guess in the technological space, you've mentioned the container-based toilets, but there's also a few other innovations that you've had a chance to work with, but have apparently not been adopted as well in the global south. One particular toilet is this toilet developed at Eawag, which I think it's called the Otaki toilet. Could you tell me a bit about your experience with this particular technology and I guess some of the challenges you faced?
I could start by saying that the one invention that has saved the most number of lives in human history is toilets. And the Western closets, or whatever kind of toilets that we often encounter across the world, is the same invention that goes back to almost 1,000 years. And the sewers and the centralized treatment plants and these technologies that we use are at least 100 years old in most cases. So therefore, there were a couple of people who came and said, hey, we think we might have to reinvent the toilet, and that some people includes Mr. Bill Gates. So therefore, they announced what is called the Reinvent the Toilet Challenge. They had a pot of money available for many industries and academic institutions and research institutions to kind of possibly co-create new solutions. And one of the criteria here was, if we think about toilets in a different way, number one, if we can think of a toilet as like a personal computer where everything happens in situ, what that means is the waste is treated and you're able to get some kind of fertilizer or some resource out of it. But also the water part is treated and you're able to even wash your hands with it, right? That's the level of treatment that they want. But they also, one of the criteria for the challenge was to make sure this is affordable. And we're talking in the range of 5 cents per user per day or something along those lines.
I guess that's pretty critical. Cost is very relevant because you mentioned just now India, for example, implementing 110 million toilets. So certainly.
Yeah. So affordability was yet another criteria, right? And then there were many institutions, including Eawag, which was part of this challenge and came up with innovations which could potentially solve the problems, right? That was the thinking behind this. But this, we see that it's been almost 10 years, but it has not solved the problem. None of these inventions have. And that kind of brings you to the larger questions, that technologies that work in the lab, everything is great and we're showing results, we're publishing papers, it all works at the lab scale, are somehow not working at the land scale. And when I say working, I don't mean technically working or not, right? There is this big missing piece between jumping from a lab scale to a land scale or scaling up these innovations. And that's something that I'm quite puzzled about. And that's yet another research activity that we're doing to really understand why. What are the failure pathways, or rather, what are the criteria for success if we have to scale up from lab to land? And some initial results that we found out is many of these science foundations to do breakthrough research, science foundations, etc., fund technologies at the TRL level of 1 to 3. TRL means technology readiness level. How ready is a particular technology to go into the market, right? So 1, 2, 3 is the basic level. So lots of national science foundations provide funding for such fundamental research. And then there's a lot of industries which provide money for TRL 7, 8, 9, which is the end of the scale, which means it's almost ready to go. Then the industries are incentivized to support a technology, then take it up and then market it and then make money out of it, right? However, there are not too many people who fund the TRL 4, 5, 6. And that kind of becomes a value of death for these technologies. And somehow the people in the academic field say, hey, that's not our mandate. We don't have to work on this. We are still working on fundamental things. Few applied research institutions work on, 5, 6, but often they struggle to get funding as well. And the industries, when they are asked, can you fund our innovation process here? They say that, no, we don't see how marketable this is yet. Bring it to a level where we can then take it up and then fund it, and then we might be interested. So this value of death exists.
So you're really stuck there. Academics only go to a certain stretch, and industries will only start from a certain point. So how do you manage that then? How do you get across this valley of death?
Exactly. I don't have any answers yet, but it's just to first throw light that this exists.
So there's no silver bullet for that either.
I think today if there's one conclusion that we have to come to is there is no silver bullet for any of your grand challenges.
That is true. Well, I think that's why we're having this chat, and that's why we're trying to. I should have an intelligent answer for this, but somehow you caught me off guard here. I guess it's a challenge that we have to see how it's going to develop in the coming years. But CWIS, in a way, it could fit in the CWIS principles of a mix of technologies, and hopefully through all the other principles, or by delivering on all the other principles as well, we can start to see change happening. But I think reinventing the toilet is a very interesting approach, or an interesting first step, because we're starting to question age-old technologies, things that we as human beings are so used to. And I think CWIS would then be the next step to say, well, hey, it's not just about the toilet. There's a lot more going on as a result of that. Do you think we're in the right direction?
Absolutely. I'm convinced of that, because when I started my PhD, CWIS was a very novel concept. If I said CWIS, almost nobody would really know of it outside of the few people who came up with and coined it, right? And when I finished my PhD, there was already $6 billion worth of investments that's going into CWIS from the development sector. That includes the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and others, right? So CWIS even right now has degree programs that is being offered on this topic at leading institutions, including IHE Delft. So we've really seen a major change on how much CWIS has been taken up by different fields, not just academics, but also practitioners, NGOs, financial institutions, and governments as well. So I'm very positive that CWIS as an approach really helps drive urban water and sanitation in the right direction.
And since finishing your PhD, you've also been involved in a lot of this momentum. You've been to various United Nations organized events. You've been part of both the World Bank and Asian Development Bank as well. What's it feel like taking now your research and going into that space? It must be pretty exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the core reasons, so maybe a personal story is I was never really interested in doing a PhD. I thought PhD in my mind was always something that people are working inside labs or people are theorizing something and are always stuck in a room and don't really make direct impact. It's always an indirect impact. You write science, you publish it, and you hope someone picks it up and some change happens. And right after my master's and some experience that I had in work in Chennai and so on, I was convinced that I wanted to get my hands dirty and make direct impact, because enthusiasm, unfortunately, as I realize, is also a scarce commodity. So while you have it, you really have to do something. And I was very surprised at what CWIS was back then, but also what kind of opportunities Eawag as an institution offered, because this is an applied research institution. And SANDEC especially is one of these few organizations across the world which is in the forefront of science to policy and science to practice interface. And that really convinced me that this is something that's worth pursuing. And what I understood in the process is banks such as World Bank and Asian Development Bank, UN agencies, they're all really committed people. All the people that I've met are super committed to the cause, but they all have, limited bandwidth to spend on knowledge creation. And which is where research institutions, academics really have to play a more significant role and bridge this gap between science and practice. And in my experience, what happened was, of course, CWIS was a hot topic. There was so much momentum that was going on that with the World Bank, I was able to provide some support on analyzing their projects and understanding what the big drivers and barriers. And with the Asian Development Bank, we provided a capacity development course for their specialists, their consultants, and so on, to really understand CWIS from an operational point of view. And with various UN agencies, it's also trying to advocate for this concept and then doing joint reports and publications together. And I think we've been very successful in trying to bridge this gap between science and policy in the field of CWIS. And I think that's a shining example that hopefully can be taken up for other such concepts in other fields, but also future concepts in water and sanitation as well.
No, very, very hopeful and very optimistic outlook as well. I think with more different types of players and actors in the knowledge creation and the knowledge operationalization fields coming together, I think the future looks bright, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so hopefully one day you wake up and you see the river in Chennai and it's pristine and you can take your boat and go rowing along that river and think back to all these big adventures that you've had so far.
Absolutely. That's always the dream, right? And often I tell myself that it's, when you're working in research and you see colleagues doing advanced membrane filtration, trace organic contaminants, and, you see many of those kinds of advanced research that happens in the field. And then I'm sitting here doing very basic things of, does the city's policy have sanitation mentioned in it? If so, what does it mean? And things like that, right? Or trying to understand what kind of technology, like from a very basic point of view, type of technology that's being used, does it fit, and so on. And then I sometimes tell myself that I'm trying to solve not the problem of tomorrow, but the problem of yesterday. And I really hope that at some point of time, yesterday's problems don't remain, and probably we're able to predict tomorrow's problem and solve some of it already or prevent it from happening.
But I think that's very important to think about it, because a lot of city development, a lot of the infrastructures and the way we do things are based on a lot of the historical decisions that were made. And so if we don't, I guess, rectify or solve any hiccups along the way, then these tend to be forgotten. And then we end up facing difficulties in even trying to do new things for tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So You mentioned the inspiration for being able to row in a clean river one day in Chennai. But what other key moments, books, events, or people have completely changed the course of your career and your mindset? Are there any other?
Well, I think life in general has a mix of plans and a mix of destiny. Sometimes I think these two are probably in conflict with each other, right? You can't plan something and have destiny, right? But the way I reconcile with it is life is like light. Light is both a particle but also a wave. If those two can coexist, then so can life. It has moments that you plan, but it has moments that are just destiny. For example, before entering this PhD, I thought private sector could solve all the problems in the world, and perhaps I should become a sustainable entrepreneur. I should go into the field of social entrepreneurship and sustainability and so on. And I, in fact, applied for an MBA. And somehow that did not work out. And then in a very serendipitous way, I found this job being, again, at the right place at the right time. So when I look back at events that shaped my career and my path to where I am today, I think it's really difficult to pinpoint at too many intentional plans. I do have a PhD in planning, but I do know that plans are not very useful when there are bigger external forces at play, which you can't control. But a good planner is always someone who is able to adapt. So to answer your question, I think other key moments was, of course, meeting Christoph, this whole period of time being at Eawag and having access to this wider world where they're doing interesting things. And right now I'm at a stage where I'm thinking, okay, so what now? And I am making plans, but I'm also cognizant of the fact that plans will change. And when life throws something at you, we should be ready to make the best of it.
That is true. And I tend to plan for things and day one, everything goes wrong. Well, everything doesn't follow plan. So you plan for the plan to not go according to plan.
Yeah, perhaps. But also there's this other quote of failing to plan is planning to fail.
Just true.
Which is also true to a certain extent. So again, I'm just reflecting back that it's always good to have plans, because when opportunities come towards you, you can either say, this is where I want to go, so make your choice of yes and no quite easily. But then opportunities where you can't say a no also show up, and that's where kind of destiny kicks in and your life takes a different spin.
No, very true. And I guess, dare I say, there's no silver bullet for a plan either. But you enjoy books and podcasts as well. Mm-hmm. And I noticed you mentioned to me you don't actually read fiction. You read mostly nonfiction.
Yes, that is true. I've tried many, many times to read fiction. And halfway through the book, I've gotten bored. It's somehow something I've really struggled with. Although, I want to read interesting stories that people have written, but once it's more than 50 pages, it's very hard for me to sail through fiction. However, nonfiction, somehow I find that extremely rewarding, because when I was hiking in the Arctic right after finishing my PhD, I thought I need to take a break. And there I was really doing some introspection on trying to understand, okay, who am I? What are we doing here? And things like that. And then one thing I found was something that drives me is curiosity. So I find myself to be curious about almost anything. If you have something to say, I'm willing to listen. That's almost how curious I am about things. So books, especially nonfiction, is a great way for you to understand these things. And what I find most rewarding about these nonfiction books are often they are a combination of frameworks that people think
True.
and knowledge and facts and things like that. So books do a great way of bringing knowledge and frameworks together, and that makes it super easy for me to understand and make sense of the world. And similarly, podcasts, again, that's in the last few years, about Swiss trams coming back. When you take these journeys, every 5 minutes I'm saying changing train or tram or something like that. So reading a book is very difficult in that process. However, listening to a podcast is, on the other hand,
a lot easier.
Right? And therefore, that's how I got into the habit while commuting to listen to something. And podcasts were a great source of information, often things that are more entertaining than a book, if I may say. So I also do sometimes podcast marathons when I'm cooking, when I'm on the flight, which is basically listen to 3-4 hours of podcast, often in 1.5 or 2x. And it's surprising how many such podcasts are out there where you listen to a couple of people speak for hours together.
In 1.5 and 2 times the speed. That's
yes.
And you can understand something. I find sometimes when you listen to it at its normal speed, you also sense the emotion of the conversation. You are able to better grasp the feeling or the depth that the guests are feeling at the time they're saying it.
Absolutely. But when you start to choose podcasts which are 6 hours long,
then
you often want to put them at 2x and get over with it.
Yeah, that's true. I think the longest ones I've listened to are 3 hours. But no, that's... and I guess it's non-fiction podcasts.
Oh, yes, of course.
Yeah, okay.
I am yet to come across a good fiction podcast, though. If you have recommendations, that's...
Yeah, no, I'll have to think. I think I've heard 1 or 2 before. And I'll pass them to you.
Absolutely.
Certainly.
And I think podcasts, one of the reasons why I'm also super happy to be here is I see the value of podcasts. It's wonderful because when you listen to a podcast where 2 people are talking, you almost feel like being in the same room and being part of that conversation.
This is true. This is very true. And you tend to just absorb the knowledge very easily, even if you don't listen to every single word. But it's almost like, you're stimulating your brain while you're doing something mundane, like traveling on a tram or chopping a carrot or something like that.
Perhaps, yeah.
Yeah, it's magical. And I think this is why it's also motivated me to want to bring your story and the story of many others to the world as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're doing a great job. Thanks.
No, thank you very much. So what was one of the most challenging situations that you have ever faced in your career to date, and how did you overcome it? You've worked in a lot of different case studies and contexts in the global south, and surely there's a lot of different cultures and contexts to be used to.
Yeah, so I guess what you define as a challenge is quite difficult. So it's again comes down to a mindset, right? When I look back again at my PhD, for example, oftentimes when I talk to peers or others who are doing or have done a PhD, it's often a very stressful and challenging experience. But when I look back, I felt like it was a joyride, right? I was on a paid holiday in Switzerland almost. That's how I felt. And that has a lot to do with the mindset. But not to say that luck did not play a role. I was very lucky that I was able to get data. I was able to get things in time. The reviewers of the peer review process, etc., were kind. And so there's definitely a huge factor that luck plays in. But I think this is where planning comes back, right? My plan A for a PhD did not work. I don't think my plan B also worked. So I was somewhere in plan C. If you remember, one of the first times that we spoke about using modeling such as urban beats or other interesting models that are out there to see if this mix of technologies could be planned in a way that cities could then use. But soon that did not fly. My other idea of using many, many case studies from the World Bank's experience for my PhD also did not work. So I was again in plan C. So I guess there were challenges, but having plan A, B, C, and D is kind of one way that you can overcome it. And another systematic way is to be okay with challenges and expect those to come. And I mean, I like to reflect to what the head of Google, Sundar Pichai, once said. He said, life is like juggling 5 balls. 4 of them are glass and 1 is rubber.
Oh.
And the sooner you figure out which ball the rubber ball is, the more easily you can handle. And in some cases, work becomes the rubber ball, right? So as long as you start to understand what your true priorities are, of course, we all have passions. We all are driven. Most of us are, in at least those in the field of development. There's a reason why people are there, right? And being in contexts where you see injustice, whether it's in terms of water insecurity, sanitation insecurity, basic services, environmental injustices, it can really get to you. But understanding that you have only limited bandwidth for yourself, and you can only pick few fights. Understanding that and really focusing on those fights is one way that I think helps.
Choose your battles wisely. I've heard that quote too. It's very powerful. And I think one other aspect that I'm very curious to hear about, because I've practiced it myself too, that I feel has probably played a role in this mindset, is that you do a lot of yoga, a lot of meditation, and I find this mindfulness base, or this kind of spiritual practice, however you want to see it, would have made a huge difference as well. It certainly has made a huge difference for me when I first began this practice.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm Indian, so yoga was something that was taught in school to me, that was taught since I was very little. But interestingly, it's not something that I picked up until I came to Switzerland. So it's only after I came to Switzerland that I started doing this more actively and out of interest, and not because someone asked me to do it.
Before or during that visit to Liechtenstein, when you got lost in the snow?
It could have been a trigger now that you say it. But no, I think there's yoga offers a couple of things, right? I like doing sports, whether it's trail running, doing stand-up paddling, rowing, swimming, whatever. And oftentimes these sports can get you hurt, like your muscles can get sore. There's many things that happen, right? And yoga, I found, was an excellent way to prevent that from happening.
Okay.
But also it is one of those things that you can moderate. Like I want to do something every day, but I don't think I can run every day. I don't think I can swim every day, definitely not in this winter. And most other sports in Switzerland are super expensive anyway. So if you're going to pace out your hard sports, then the other days become suddenly free. And I was thinking, why not yoga? And that's how it kind of started. And then I started really seeing the value in it. Since I started consistently doing yoga, I've not had any injuries that came out of sport.
Oh, great.
Unless I fell somewhere. But I think that's an excellent reason why you do yoga.
Certainly, yes.
And also, it gives you a reason to wake up every day. And before you start thinking about work or before you start thinking and planning the whole day, that morning, like for example, I do 3 or 4 times a day from 7 to 8 a.m. around. And that period, when you're doing it, it really calms your mind. And it gives you 1 hour that is fully for yourself. That you're not thinking about answering emails, that you're not thinking about sending replies to the WhatsApp messages or thinking about the deadlines that you have.
Or liking cat videos on YouTube or TikTok.
Perhaps. And I think I found a lot of reason there. And when I say yoga, I'm also including some part of meditation in it. Mm-hmm. Because, of course, yoga can also mean meditation in some sense that one is for the body and the other is for the mind. And yoga is one way that these two are intertwined. Mm-hmm. But practicing mindfulness and meditation is something I think many of us should do because we all have fast lives. And there's ample scientific evidence on the benefits that these offers. There's, again, an excellent podcast from the Huberman Lab that scientifically breaks down the effects of meditation and so on. So there's a lot of convincing arguments on the science.
We'll definitely put a link to that particular episode in the show notes. And maybe we can share some books as well that you and I have read.
Absolutely.
I've had a few that I can recommend.
But personally, what I found is when the days that you get enough sleep, the days that you do yoga and some meditation, are often the days that turn out to be great, are often the days that you are not drained in the end, are often the days that when something doesn't go right, you're not affected too much by it personally or emotionally. And I think there's benefit to that. And since I've experienced it, I'm convinced about what could be useful out of it.
So you primarily do it in the mornings after you wake up?
Absolutely. Yeah, because I think waking up basically means coming out of slumber. And I don't think I had enough motivation to go running in the morning or go to a gym or anything. So yoga is a very slow and nice way of waking up. And meditation, again, is the same for your mind. And it's really impacted my life in a positive way.
Okay, which is interesting because I somehow do it in the evenings because my mind tends to race before I go to bed. And so it's a way of calming me down. But I must try doing it in the mornings a bit more often and seeing these effects, because I certainly want to wake up, energized and calm at the same time. So
yeah, that's really interesting because having thoughts when you go to sleep is common.
Yes.
But when you have lots of them, your sleep gets affected. And one really interesting way that I started benefiting from is writing things down. Some people call it journaling, but some people just call it, taking notes on a piece of paper so that what's on your mind is now on a piece of paper. And then you can actually go to sleep. And especially during a PhD, when your mind is really stimulated, you have all these ideas. Sometimes you have great ideas. Sometimes you have quite terrible ones, but having a book next to you, I even remember there were a couple of times that quite late into the night, I was not really falling asleep, but because I was just thinking about something, having ideas. And then when I wrote them into a piece of paper, I slept like a log. And then the next morning, when I saw that piece of paper, I thought, oh, I'm a genius. That was a really useful way which then helped me frame CWIS and come up with a planning framework and so on. And those were actually not the days that I spent in the library writing something, but actually the days that all of that information was kind of being processed. And suddenly you had some ideas that you wrote on a piece of paper and the next day it started to make a lot of sense.
That you can build upon.
Absolutely. And this was actually one of the foundations for one of my papers on how to plan for CWIS. And I think that really paid good dividends.
Okay. To me, the ideas come in the shower, but I guess each to their own and each with their own uniqueness.
Maybe a waterproof pen and paper would still help you in the shower.
I think they do exist. I've heard that you can get waterproof pen and paper for diving or some other reason.
Yeah.
But that's a whole nother story. We're going on tangents. But you really seem to have organized different processes, different strategies around your life. But what kinds of tips for time management can you offer? How do you balance the personal and the professional life?
Is a challenge. I can't lie. And I've had my partner, my wife, say that you're doing a lot of things, not necessarily as a complaint, but also as a compliment, that you're doing a lot of things at home and how. And I think, again, it comes back to planning a little bit. Having priorities, and maybe if I have to give you like 3 frameworks to kind of help structure this, is number 1, really knowing your priorities, right? I spoke about these glass balls and this rubber ball, right? Really knowing what the glass balls in your life are and knowing what the rubber balls are.
And that's a really good analogy.
Yeah, it really helps you make sense of what to spend time on. And the second thing is having good plans. And when I say plans, I mean plans for the week, plans for the day, but also plans for long term. And what I do is try to have a vision that this is what I want to do by the end of the year, or by the end of 2 years, or by the end of the PhD or postdoc or whatever, right? And then you start to break those plans down to then see what does this mean in more achievable timelines. Because another really interesting quote that I love is, we often overestimate what we can do in a day, but underestimate what we can do in a year.
That is so true.
Right? So this is another interesting way that you can start to have good plans, and then you know when to say no. I think when you have a clear vision and an opportunity comes, or you have a request that comes, you will know whether saying yes or no is in line with your plan or not. And therefore you will be more confident in saying yes and no and making your life that much better. And the third thing is using good tools. Like, for example, Post-its is something that you use on a daily basis.
I can relate to that.
Yeah. But on a project level, I don't think having so many Post-its really help, right? So I use Notion. It's an app that is available where you can take notes, but also have like a project management template that can help. So it's a really excellent way that has helped me. But also then having other kinds of time management tools. For example, when I know I have a lot of small tasks in one day that are not necessarily deep tasks, but things that I need to have good amount of presence in doing those tasks and not get distracted, I use the Pomodoro technique, which is where you spend 25 minutes doing something and taking a 5-minute break and then repeating until you get tired, right? That has worked really well for me in the past, and it's still something I continue to do when I have a set number of tasks that I want to achieve in a day.
And it's quite useful because you can get these kitchen timers that are shaped like pomodoros or tomatoes and use them to help time your sessions.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah. But all this is to say that these tools exist, these frameworks exist, these fundamental priority setting and all these things exist, but not to say that I do the most optimal job out of this. I am a productivity nut. I do like it. I want to optimize things, but I'm getting there.
You're getting there. I think we're all learning as we go, and we discover new things in time. And so what advice can you offer to young professionals in the development and sanitation sector who are starting out?
Yeah. I think one advice that would be helpful is understanding that you can't change the world overnight. And one quote that really, again, moves me is, you can't do all the things that the world needs, but all the things that you do, the world needs. So every bit helps, right? And really knowing and finding what they say as your ikigai which is what are you good at, what do you like doing, and what does the world need? Finding that space and then really doubling down on that will do you a whole lot of good, but also the world a lot of good. So I think in those cases, look for synergies and not trade-offs. Don't try to cut down on your personal time just to solve the world's crisis. You might not be able to be as productive or as motivated if you were finding synergies in the process and doing something that both gives you satisfaction and rewards your own experience, but also helps the world.
I guess to draw parallels from a quote that you also mentioned earlier, it's a case of people overestimate how much they can change the world in a day, but underestimate how much they can change the world in a year.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And when we talk about development, I think these are decade-old phenomenons. So something I hope is CWIS was started about 5 years ago. And I hope that in another 5 years, there's an entire decade that has gone by. At the end of that decade, I hope that we can actually see concrete results.
No, definitely. And I'm looking forward to observing that journey together with you. And at some point, collaborating, maybe using those models to then help promote citywide inclusive sanitation. Where can people reach you if they want to get in touch?
Yeah, so I am active on social media, primarily LinkedIn and Twitter. So you can follow me on either of them. And if you want to reach me personally, you can find my details at the Eawag website, or if you Google me, there's one or two places where you can find me.
And we'll definitely put some of these links into the show notes. But Abishek, it's been a lovely conversation, and I'm really happy to have gone deep into citywide inclusive sanitation. I know when you first spoke to me about it many years back, I was just as clueless, but now I feel like I've learned a lot and also gotten a few productivity tips from you that I can also implement in my own life. So I really appreciate it. And thank you to you listeners as well for joining me in this conversation. But Abishek, as with every guest, I leave the last word to you. One message for the listeners to take away from today.
If you listen to the last 30, 40 minutes, you'd have definitely realized that one thing that kept coming up was there is really no silver bullet to solving the world's problems, but there are many alternative bullets that we should keep in our armory.
Thank you very much. And thank you to you listeners for tuning in to this fun and encouraging conversation with Dr. Abishek Narayan. As mentioned, you can find links to papers, policy briefs, and online courses from the comfort of your toilet in our show notes over at petermbach.com/podcast. If you enjoyed this show and are looking forward to more episodes, please do subscribe or follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you are listening from to be notified of the latest release as soon as it becomes available. I would be incredibly grateful for this, as it helps me to reach a broader audience and, who knows, perhaps inspire more mindful approaches to day-to-day challenges or a more conscious understanding of the consequences of every toilet flush. If you would like to know more about me or my work in general, you can also check out my website at petermbach.com, my YouTube channel, Peter Marcus Bach, that's Marcus with a C, or follow me on Twitter at petermbach or Instagram at petermbach87. If you have feedback or suggestions, or just know someone who has an inspiring story to offer, please feel free to reach out to me on social media. The podcast's intro and outro song is called Bicolia by Bureaucratic. Stay tuned for our next episode and next guest to hear how they are tackling the grand challenges.